Good morning and welcome back to the third day of the 30th annual Vanier College Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide. I'm Marlene Grossman. I'm coordinator of the event, and I do this event in conjunction with the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation. This year, we've also partnered with the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies, as well as we are co-sponsored by the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. I would like to welcome Patricia Chappine. She's an adjunct professor at Stockton University, where she teaches courses in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Historical Studies programs. She's an adjunct in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies graduate program at Gratz College. She earned a BA in sociology and an MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Stockton University. She also earned an MA and a PhD in history and culture from Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. Her research interests include Holocaust and Genocide Studies, women's history, New Jersey history, digital humanities, and civic activism. She's a board member at large of the OHMAR, the Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region. So welcome, Patricia.
Hello, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I have a little PowerPoint presentation just to kind of, keep me on task and give you a little bit of a visual aid, so you're not just looking at me as much as I know you'd like to just stare at me the whole time. But so I'm going to screen share for a second. Oh, I'm disabled. Hold on 1 second. Okay, so it's telling me that I can't screen share. Is there any way we can fix that? Or, I mean, I could just talk, that's okay too.
Just 1 minute here and we'll have you working.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, you should be all set now.
Okay, looks good, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start off with some brief overview of women in the Holocaust, and the overall presentation is just going to be a little bit of kind of a broad generalization of some work that's been done on the topic of women as both rescuers and resistance workers. And this is a very, very broad topic, so I'm not even going to be able to really skim the surface, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the different things that have been going on in the field, and even where the field is yet to go, hopefully in the near future. So with the topic of women in resistance activities and rescue efforts, it's really an offshoot of this initiative that took place, a couple decades ago, and looking at the Holocaust through what they like to call a gendered lens. So in other words, in recognizing that men and women experience events differently due to many factors, including gender-based socialization patterns. So this is really a very interdisciplinary area of study, which is great. I mean, the more the different academic areas like sociology and literature and, anthropology even, they kind of meld together, and it's been a very kind of a very exciting field, especially as of late. So mostly this type of scholarship offers an expansion and kind of a widening of the lens with which we view the Holocaust. So for instance, within descriptions, if you read memoirs, even post-war interviews, men and women often focus on different experiences and even use kind of distinct coping mechanisms. They also face gender-based violence as well. And Myrna Goldenberg describes this as men and women basically facing different horrors, but the same hell during the Holocaust. So in an edited book that she worked on by the same name, Different Horrors, Same Hell, Goldenberg and Amy Shapiro actually collected work by notable scholars in the field. So this was about a decade ago at this point. Wow. So the issues discussed within that book included things like feminist theories of the Holocaust, violence against women during genocide, gendered analysis of the Holocaust, and much more. In their introduction, Goldenberg and Shapiro write, quote, "The collection of essays is meant to introduce new discourses, to upset traditional ways of knowing and telling, to stimulate the creation of new knowledges that reflect a diversity of experiences. We hope these chapters will disrupt or at least create some discomfort around traditionally accepted assumptions." And nearly a decade after its publication, scholars are still adding more nuanced studies to the field. So with this in mind, hopefully my presentation will aim at giving a very concise overview of the unique experiences of women as both resistors and rescuers. And I'll also highlight just a few of the many individuals who engaged in these activities. So in the beginning, when we're talking about serious inquiry into the topic of women in the Holocaust, we really begin about 1983 with a conference that was organized by Joan Ringelhelm and Esther Katz. So this conference really laid the groundwork for the future of a gendered analysis of the Holocaust and eventually other genocides. And in another work about the same time that was published about 2003, Myrna Goldenberg worked with Elizabeth Baer to create an edited volume called Experience and Expression. And one of the quotes that I think really kind of brings out the idea of the importance of the field from that work is this, quote, "From the first, scholarship and testimony focused on women as victims, or more precisely as intended victims. Although a small but emerging body of literature dealt with the experience of women who actively fought Nazi oppression individually, and less often as acknowledged but lesser members of resistance groups." So again, we're kind of just, the field really is focused on widening this lens of inquiry and telling these stories that weren't necessarily always the focus in mainstream scholarship. So in the early stages of this analysis, scholars began to ask, where are the women? And this led to a focus on filling in the gaps in traditional Holocaust scholarship. As academic inquiry on the topic increased, research questions became more nuanced. In the Introduction to Experience and Expression, Baer and Goldenberg present their readers with observable differences in the memoirs of Jewish women imprisoned in concentration camps. One experience is a recount of Isabella Lentner's experience as retold in her memoir called Fragments of Isabella. And she said, "If you are sisterless, you do not have the pressure or the absolute responsibility to end the day alive." So this is an example of a coping mechanism, and one that's often talked about in memoirs and in interviews dealing with women who survived the Holocaust. So forming surrogate families in the camps, using their imaginations to plan events after liberation, reciting recipes, using gendered metaphors to express their experiences and more, all represented coping strategies frequently observed in the memoirs and interviews of women survivors. And in other words, quote, "Gender-based experiences before the rise of Hitler conspicuously shaped women's responses to the Holocaust." So with resistance specifically, according to Yad Vashem, which is an amazing research to kind of delve into this topic even more deeply, the website describes resistance as, quote, "a wide range of acts that directly or indirectly defied Nazi laws, policies, or ideology. Such activities always endangered the lives of those engaged in them and were taken by both non-Jews and Jews by men and women. The final solution did not distinguish between men and women. However, women experienced the degradation, humiliation differently, and are therefore worth studying as a separate group." So such things as stereotypes as women being passive and unthreatening sometimes prevented them from being suspected as part of resistance movements. In addition, Jewish women often had more contact with non-Jewish neighbors and were therefore slightly more familiar with Christian mores, which helped if they needed to assume a false identity. For these reasons and others, women were able to resist the Nazis in different ways than men, both spiritually and physically. Women who could pass as German could move around and engage in information gathering, smuggling, and other activities that required them to be seen by the Nazis. Women who were involved in socialist, communist, or Zionist youth movements often engaged in resistance. Some women even escaped to the forests of Eastern Europe and joined partisan units, which is one of the pictures I'm showing here. And some worked with the French resistance. Some even resisted Nazis from within the concentration camps, which I'll give you a specific example in a little bit. So these are the different forms. Like I said, women could be couriers, partisans. Within the ghettos, there were often different resistance movements depending on the type and the population of the different areas, and also spiritual resistance. So, I mean, there are many different kinds of resistance that women could engage in, and it ran along a spectrum from broad organized movements to very personal individual resistance. So according to Nahama Tech, even in rare cases when a woman brought a weapon into the forest, it was confiscated. Guns belonged to men, not women. So it's estimated that about 10% of all partisans active during the Holocaust were women. Like I said, this could be, we could discover a lot more later on, but right now that's about where we're at with the percentage. So it was a rarity that women were armed in these units, but occasionally it did happen. In fact, there's a memoir written by Faye Shulman, who I'll talk a little bit more, talk about later. She was actually armed as a member of a partisan group in Eastern Europe. But like I said, it depended on the unit, it depended on how many weapons they could actually obtain. Oftentimes it was a very difficult thing to even arm themselves. So within these groups, women usually did domestic tasks if they were even involved. So sometimes partisan units wouldn't even allow women or children to, join the group at all. So it varied greatly depending on the group and the area that we're talking about. So sometimes they would also serve as nurses. They would transport different items, and they would often go on recon missions. Okay, so one example of resistance within a camp occurred, and people are probably very familiar with this, but there was a prisoner revolt at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And what happened in short was about October 7, 1944, the Sonderkommando working at the crematorium in Birkenau, they rebelled after learning they were going to be killed. But for months before this actual rebellion, there were women involved that were working in the munitions factory. So within the camp, they had, cleverly smuggled out, usually in little hems they had made within their dress uniforms. So they would smuggle out gunpowder. And what ended up happening is eventually there was enough that they actually destroyed this entire crematorium, which if you ever go to the Auschwitz Museum in Poland, you can see that they never, because it was so close to the end, they never actually rebuilt that crematorium. So as a monument, it's just rubble, and it's still there as a testament to what these men and women were able to do, in the camp under very close guard, malnourished, and these things. So there were a couple women that were kind of leading in this. There's a picture of Ella Gardner there for you, but others were Esther Weisblum and Regina Safferstein and Rosa Rabata. So they all helped to kind of transport this gunpowder to members of the Sonderkommando, and eventually they did end up blowing up one of the crematoria. Okay, so I'm not going to click on these interviews, but this is a picture of Faye Shulman. Like I said, she wrote a memoir about being a partisan, which I recommend, and it's really a great read for any age, from high school up, I'd say. Even middle school probably would be all right. But so before the war, Faye Shulman lived in Lenin, Poland. She learned photography to help her brother with his business. And in August 1942, the Nazis actually came to their small village and killed about 1,850 Jews, including Faye's parents, her sister, and her younger brother. Faye was spared because of her photographic skills. The Nazis actually ordered her to develop their photographs, and these photographs actually included the massacre of, her village. So she did this, but she also secretly made copies as evidence. During a partisan raid, she took the opportunity to run into the forest, and she ended up joining a group of escaped members of the Soviet Red Army. So she was in that partisan unit. She had no medical experience, but she ended up learning how to be a nurse for that group. Like I said, this is one of those typical kind of gendered jobs that women often took on even during the war, even with no prior experience. She actually was able to recover her old camera during a partisan raid that her group, they raided her hometown, and she was able to find her old camera equipment. So then, as an example, you could see this photo. She was actually able to very quickly document her time with the partisans. So not only is this a unique story because she was one of the few partisans that was able to engage in these armed raids, but she was also able to document these, and her pictures are very they really show what she went through in the forest, and it's a very unique kind of perspective. So estimates are that she took over 100 photos of this partisan group that she was involved in. And it's interesting, sometimes as she recounts it, when they were raided, sometimes they would leave the area of the forest that they were camped in, and sometimes she would actually bury her camera and the film and then have to go back later and find it and dig it up. But throughout the war, she did this, and she ended up saving a lot of this footage, and now it's out there and people can view it. So, and she also did a lot of short interviews, like I said, which I won't show you right now, but it's worth kind of looking at. YouTube that. So with rescue, this quote by Elie Wiesel is also included in Carol Rittner's book, The Courage to Care. And it emphasizes these moral choices that are made to help those in need, often at great personal risk. So Wiesel said, in those times, there was darkness everywhere in heaven and on earth. All the gates of compassion seemed to have been closed. The killer killed and the Jews died, and the outside world adopted an attitude either of complicity or of indifference. Only a few had the courage to care. These few men and women were vulnerable, afraid, helpless. What made them different? Why were there so few? There is always a moment when moral choice is made, and so we must know these good people who helped Jews during the Holocaust. We must learn from them, and in gratitude and hope, we must remember them. So it's just a few different stories. And again, if you want to go and look up the actual award that's given, the Medal of the Righteous, Yad Vashem website kind of catalogs every person that was recognized during this time. And beginning in 1963, it recognized to date about 27,700 people that were considered righteous among the nations, and over half of them were actually women. So just a little interesting aside. One of these stories I like to tell is Marion Pritchard. And again, her story is, it's vast. So I'm just going to kind of hit on a couple main points. So she was a Dutch social worker during the Holocaust, and estimates are about 150 Dutch Jews that she saved during her time with the resistance movement. Mostly those were children. So she, according to her, she was actually inspired by witnessing Nazis kind of very roughly throwing Jewish children into the back of a truck. And in an interview, she described the situation. She said, quote, "It was a beautiful spring morning, and it was a street I had known since I had been born. And all of a sudden, you see little kids picked up by their pigtails or by a leg and thrown over the side of a truck." And she goes on to describe that she saw two women trying to stop the men, and they themselves were also thrown into the back of the truck, and then they disappeared. So at one point during her rescue efforts, Pritchard actually killed a Dutch policeman to protect 3 Jewish children she was hiding. When the policeman brought the Nazis into her home, or at least the one that the resistance has set up for her, they failed to find the children hidden under the floorboards. However, as Pritchard recounted, quote, "An hour later, after I had let the children out because the youngest 2-month-old Erica was crying, the policeman came back alone. I felt I had no choice but to shoot him. So she killed the policeman, and a friend enlisted the help of a local baker who came to get the body. And an undertaker actually agreed to bury the body on top of another to avoid suspicion. And Pritchard continued to hide the children. She arranged host families to keep them safe and even obtained forged documents for the duration of the war. So that family she was living with made it out, and she was responsible for saving over 100 other people. Another rescuer was Maria von Maltin, and she was wealthy, so she had a little bit more pull. I feel like she could get away with a little bit more, but from even early on, so from 1933, the very early stages of Nazism in Germany, she was engaged in resistance and rescue activities, which included falsifying paperwork. She actually physically drove people to safety out of Berlin. And it's estimated that she saved about 60 Jews during this time. She also hid someone that she was romantically involved with. So Hans Herschel, she married him after, but she actually hid him in several secret areas. You know, she had hollowed out a couch, and so he could hide in there when, just in case the Gestapo came in and searched, which they actually did on a few occasions. But in one incident that she recounts, Maria was actually visited by Nazi officials. They searched her home. Hans was hidden in the hollowed out couch. But when they asked her to open the sofa bed, she said it was stuck. And with this kind of feigned confidence, Maria said, "If you don't believe me, shoot through the couch, but I insist you basically pay me for the damage." And I mean, luckily for her and Hans, they left without actually shooting through the couch. But you know, she just basically kind of used this false sense of confidence to confront these Nazis, and you know, she ended up saving quite a few people. And of course, Irena Sendler, another person I like to spotlight. She was she's a Polish social worker and also nurse. It's estimated she saved about 2,500 children during this time. And she and her coworkers buried these lists of hidden children in jars so they could be found and then returned to their families later on. She used her credentials as a Polish social worker to enter the Warsaw Ghetto and smuggle children out. And she and her aides forged about 3,000 documents for Jewish families. And she eventually joined the children's division of the Polish Council to Aid Jews. And there are a few ways that she used to take the children out of the ghetto, including through sewers. She used an ambulance. There was a passage through the courthouse, or she would hide them in a trolley. So she made sure each family hiding a child realized the child must be returned to their Jewish relatives after the war, which is again why she hid the information in jars to be found later, just in case, you know, something happened and she didn't want to be found with that information, so the Nazis would be able to track people. In 1943, she was actually arrested, questioned, and tortured. And during the questioning, she had her legs and feet fractured. She was scheduled to be executed, but other members of the Polish underground had bribed the executioner to let her go. Posters about her death were even circulated the next day, and she stayed hidden for the rest of the war. After the final defeat of the Germans, she began the processing of digging up the jars and reuniting the children with their families. And amazingly, almost all of the parents and children Irena saved, they went on to find either relatives or be adopted. So, I mean, it's really impressive. 2,500 children, estimates are. So if you actually search life in a jar online, you can come up with, there's this whole project that was, it was started by school children and their teacher, and it just grew into this very amazing online exhibition and information gathering group. So I recommend searching life in a jar for more information about that. And so in closing, I just kind of want to leave you with this. There's a lot of different information, like I said, but one of the best sources I've found is the Institute for the Study of Rescue and Altruism in the Holocaust. And of course, Yad Vashem, like I mentioned, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is always a great resource. And the Shoah Foundation has a great YouTube channel with these amazing videos that they're always adding. And even more so than the Holocaust, they add videos about people that have experienced other genocide. And there's a lot of educational videos too. So I know this was a very kind of concise overview of things, but I hope it at least served for a starting point. And if anyone has any questions, then I would love to answer those, but let me get out of the screen for you and stop that share. Okay.
Thank you.
Someone did ask me how I got interested, if you want me to answer that, or do I have time?
For me, Patricia.
Hi.
Hi. Patricia,
Did you
can you
want me
hear
to
me?
answer that?
Can you hear me, Patricia?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. So I just wanted to mention before you answer that, I was just going to mention to people, if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A box and we will get to them as soon as possible. Patricia, I want to thank you for a great presentation. Before we go to the questions, and people have more interest, they can always look it up on their own, but gives you a short overview. Okay, so moving to questions. So did you want to answer the first question?
Yeah, so what got me interested in the Holocaust? You know, I was at Stockton University as an undergrad, and we had a lot of general studies requirements because it's such a major program there. You know, there's a minor in Holocaust studies and there's a master's and a great resource center. So I was just kind of taking a general education course, and the professor, who happened to be Dr. Carol Rittner, was just so amazing in not only the history behind what happened, but she asked these very kind of deep ethical questions about the event. And I just, you know, for the first time, I feel like in my undergraduate career, I was actually very interested and passionate about these questions that she was asking. And, you know, the major, how could this happen? How do we prevent it from happening? You know, what's the future going to be like? Can we use this as a teaching tool? So I got very passionate and, you know, idealistic during my undergraduate time. And so I just kind of kept going with it. And that was how I got interested.
Thank you. Another question. Are you aware of Judy Balian's book on Polish women's resistors?
Yes. And I have a huge class that I teach for grads about women in the Holocaust. And it was so difficult to pick and choose things for this presentation because there's just so many things consistently being written about the topic. And the great thing about it is really that everything is getting more and more nuanced. So you're seeing people, you know, in the archives finding these stories that wouldn't necessarily be found. You know, like I just did some research about Army nurses from America that liberated concentration camps. And there's, you know, a lot that I saw at the Holocaust Memorial Museum that really, it shows how these women witnessed and dealt with the aftermath of the concentration camps. So, I mean, it really, just the way that they describe things, it's really yet another area where there's not a whole lot of study. And it's just really amazing to see the different areas. Like the lens just keeps widening, and it's a very exciting thing.
So I'm just going to put, somebody wrote in the chat how wonderful it was to hear a presentation from a woman's perspective. So I just wanted to forward that. But another
Thank you.
question, somebody wanted to know about your thoughts on Ukraine, if you have any.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, like I said, because I got into this study because I felt that there was a change that could be made and that eventually these things would not stop altogether. I guess that's kind of like in a perfect world, they would stop altogether, but it's frustrating to see these human rights atrocities continue to happen. And it just, without getting into the history and everything, it my empathy, it's upsetting to see,
Thank you. Somebody else in the chat wrote, thank you. Marion Pritchard came to our synagogue many years ago. She was amazing and kept saying she just did the right thing, saving those children that you had spoken about.
Wow. Yeah. She was just such an amazing story and an amazing woman. And, she always in anything that I saw, any interviews by Marion Pritchard, it was always, kind of a matter of fact, well, that was the right thing to do attitude, what else could I do? And one of her quotes was something like, we all have those moments in life where we wish we would have done something and didn't. And it kind of haunts you if you don't. So that always kind of stuck with me about her story.
So I have a question. So I teach a course on anti-Semitism, and of course we touch on the Holocaust because you can't not talk about anti-Semitism without talking about the Holocaust. But one of the other things we talk about, and this is a research-based course, is Holocaust denial, especially Holocaust denial online. Do you have any thoughts about how to, since it's so rampant right now, how to combat Holocaust denial, distortion online or in person for that matter?
Yeah, it's interesting because I just recently created a course about that for grads, Holocaust denial and abuse, where we deal with a lot of the kind of modern ramifications of hate speech on social media. And I feel like one of the key takeaways from that in teaching is the importance of media literacy and critical thinking, and kind of equipping students early on with this idea of how do you find sources that are reliable, and how do you, in scrolling through these very quick blips that you see and get shared, how do you then combat that with critical thinking and, actually being able to find reputable sources and things like that. So I think a lot of it is in equipping students to recognize misinformation and hate speech. And one of the tools that I use is the Southern Poverty Law Center has a very interactive map. It's called a hate map. And they actually keep track of these different organizations. And it's a very, it's shocking to see, because a lot of the students will then go on and say, oh, I live in this state, and wow, I never realized that. So I think a lot of people think it's a relic of the past as well, that it's not something that if they're not exposed to it, they don't realize that it's still very, very problematic. So I hope that answered it. So I could talk about that for hours. But
I know it's a hard one to tackle for sure.
Very important subject though, extremely important, especially now.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. There's no more questions coming in. So I would like to thank you for bringing your perspective and the perspective of women to the symposium, because I think it's something that's sadly missed oftentimes. And again, thank you on behalf of Vanier College for attending the symposium and participating. And on behalf of Vanier, also to all the participants that are watching today, thank you for watching. Please tune into all of our other sessions. There's the commemoration service coming up in about an hour or so. And thank you and have a great week.
Thank you
you.
so much. Take care.